Mark Magsayo upsets Gary Russell Jr. And this was an upset pick that I know a couple people were picking coming in. D-Style, who I'll talk about on the about this fight on the podcast later on, I believe picked Magsayo to win by a close, controversial decision coming in. I think the reason that was a growing trend was the issues coming in for Gary Russell Jr. He stated he had an injury. His dad was having health issues. On top of that 2-year layoff, on top of the 1-year layoff this guy always seems to have. Gary Russell Jr. just not an active fighter. Just not an active fighter. It's frustrating to watch for a guy with so much talent to be so inactive. All that being said, Magsayo coming in, I thought in his last fight, he showed some flashes of being a great fighter, but at the same time, he showed flashes of being a mediocre fighter as well. Inconsistent there. Inconsistencies, but he still got the knockout in that fight. So you said, okay, let's see what happens going forward. He gets the fight with Gary Russell Jr. and he upsets him. He did what he had to do to win this fight. Even with the injuries coming in. Even with everything Gary Russell Jr. had coming into this fight, the popular pick, Vegas had Gary Russell Jr. a heavy betting favorite coming in. So a lot of people slept on Magsayo. And look, you entered the ring who you are. Gary Russell Jr. entered the ring knowingly with a shoulder injury, so no excuses. On top of that, if you watch the fight, the first 3 rounds, Gary Russell Jr. was actually throwing some jabs. Not as many as normal. He's one of the top fighters in the sport at consistently throwing a jab. He averages almost 40 jabs per round, which is high, very high. So to see him go strictly left hand from the 4th round on, obviously, that's not the Gary Russell Jr. that we expect. But the first 3 rounds, he was throwing that jab. So what happened? In the 4th round, Magsayo hits Gary Russell Jr. with the sweeping right hook and then a left jab to the shoulder, the hurt shoulder. And you saw Gary Russell Jr., he was very... he was hurt, and it showed. He went like this, grimaced, and then stopped throwing the right hand for the rest of the fight. So credit to Magsayo for targeting that right shoulder. I have a feeling they knew coming in that the right shoulder was hurt. They certainly knew that from the first 3 rounds that something was going on with the right hand. And Magsayo, I feel like, targeted that right shoulder, and smart move on his part. Where I saw some lacking from Magsayo was, if you have a guy who's only using one hand, why not circle around that hand? And you can argue that's not who Magsayo is. He's not going to deviate from what he does, which is come forward, strictly come forward, pressure fighter. But if you have a guy who is throwing 25 punches per round and all of them are straight lefts, you might want to step to the left and get away from his straight left hand. Maybe he's thinking that if he does that Gary Russell Jr. will spin out and he's not going to be able to catch up to Gary Russell Jr., possibly. But I just felt like he could have done a better job of getting out of the way of those straight left hands. I also feel like he could have done a better job of fighting at a high pace, which he didn't do, to be honest. Middle rounds, he kind of got away from fighting at that high pace, pressure. And 10th round, 11th round, he got back to that and won those rounds. Now, as far as the scorecards go, 114, 115, 113 twice. I had it 117, 111 Magsayo. Admittedly, I was on the... Everybody seemed to have it between 116, 112, and 115, 113 Magsayo. You had some people 114, 114. You had a couple people like me, 117, 111 Magsayo. I just felt like it's tough for me to give rounds to a guy who's throwing 20 punches per round and they're all the same hand, all the same punch. It's difficult for me to score a fight like that when he's fighting a pressure fighter who is bringing the fight to him, which is why I gave 9 rounds to Magsayo. That being said, there were close rounds, and Magsayo it almost seemed like was trying to bail Gary Russell Jr. out because he had the fight locked. I mean, he was up halfway through, was looking good. It was clear Gary Russell Jr. could not use his right hand. And like I was saying, those middle rounds, he didn't fight at the high pace that you expect. Now, credit Gary Russell Jr. for that. He was using the one hand. He was using it well. He was using his movement. Even with the one hand, he looked like Gary Russell Jr. in spurts. So you give credit to Gary Russell Jr. for being a talented fighter. But there are clear inconsistencies with Magsayo watching him as a fighter. He's up and down as the fight goes on. He'll have his lulls. It seemed to be middle rounds. The past 2 fights I've seen with him, the middle rounds seem to be, he goes into some sort of lull. That being said, he got the victory. I had a 117, 111. I just thought that he was doing enough work in those rounds to win those rounds. I see people out there saying it's a robbery. There's no way. I don't see how you could have got to 6 rounds, much less 7, for Gary Russell Jr., who was using one hand the whole fight for the most part. So, Magsayo, at the end of the day, we can talk about Gary Russell Jr.'s injury, his deficiencies. We can talk about Magsayo's deficiencies in this fight, his inconsistencies. But Magsayo got a big victory for himself. Big victory for himself. And now he moves into a driver's seat. He has one of the 4 major belts. And big things are going to come his way at 126. It's not a deep division. It's not a talent-rich division. So he fits right in somewhere in that top 5. So good for him. Some nice paydays are going to come for him at 126 the next year or 2. So good for Magsayo. I don't know where his ceiling is. We'll see as each fight goes on. But good for Magsayo. Mark Magsayo upsets Gary Russell Jr. I'm out. God bless. Peace.